Hello my dear students of class 8. Today I am going to continue with you the story that we started from the supplementary text, that is the very amusing story the open window. Okay. So, open your supplementary textbooks and let us continue with the story of the brilliant young girl and how she manages to trick a much older man, Mr. Frampton Nuttall, into believing something very ridiculous about their family. Okay. So, open your textbook and open your supplementary textbook, that is open page number 55. Now, as I was telling you in the previous class about a little bit of background about Frampton Nuttall, he was a man who was suffering from a nerval problem. Okay, he had a nervous disorder. He had some problems with his nerves, and so his doctor had prescribed him, rather advised him to go and stay in the countryside for a while. Now, he was not very sure about it. Anyway, on the insistence of his doctor, he decided to go to the countryside. His sister, however, tells him that when you go to the countryside, you cannot simply sit at home and do nothing throughout the day, because in that manner, if you stay alone in your house in the countryside, then it will be even more difficult for you to lead or come back to the normal life, and maybe your nerves disorder with your nerves will become worse. The disease that you have will become worse with moping. Okay. So, what did she do? She wrote letters of introduction to all the people in that countryside, in that neighborhood where Frampton Nuttall was going to live, and she decided to introduce him to all of them in each of his letters, because she already had lived in that place for a while and she knew all of them. Okay. Then let us begin from page number 56. Now, Frampton Nuttall, now Mr. Nuttall is in the process of introducing himself to a young lady of 16, and he has actually come to visit a Mrs. Stapleton at her house, and he is simply waiting for her to come down and join him. Before that, the niece of that woman comes down to meet him and tells him that her aunt will be down shortly for the meeting. Okay. Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Stapleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. Okay. So, remember his sister had very casually told him that some of them, as far as I remember, were quite nice. Okay. So, she has actually written letters of introduction to all the people that she knew, and she just told her already eccentric brother that only a handful of them are quite nice. Okay. Some of them are quite nice. So, Mr. Nuttall was even worried about that, and so he is just continuing that train of thought in this page, and he is saying that he hoped Mrs. Stapleton was one of the nice group, okay, about whom his sister has spoken about, had spoken. Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Stapleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. Do you know many of the people around here? Asked the niece, when she judged that they had sufficient silent communion. So, he was sitting there silently, he was not talking with the young girl, okay, he was not making an effort at conversation. So, when she decided that we have been silent for quite a long time, communion means like a communication, okay, like here it means that the silent communication between the two, that means they had been sitting in silence for a long time. Then she decided to break the silence by asking him a question. She was a smart girl, she was a self-possessed, self-confident girl. So, she did not have much awkwardness while talking to Mr. Nuttall, whereas Mr. Nuttall, being an adult man, he had some troubles in communication. So, she simply asked him, did you know anybody here? And he said, hardly a soul. My sister was staying here some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here. Okay. He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. Why do you think? Why do you think the regret is there in his voice? I think you can understand that Mr. Nuttall was not a social person. He was not a person, he was not a very friendly person. He would rather be alone. He was like a recluse, okay. He would rather be left on his own than, you know, being introduced, having to get himself introduced to total strangers. But he was also pushed around a little bit by his sister, and his sister had insisted to him that he visit all these people whom she knew, okay. So when he told her that I don't know anybody here, hardly a soul means not anybody, hardly even a person. So when he said that, he actually said that with regret, that his sister had kind of written letters of introduction to all the people that she knew, and she used to live here 4 years ago. Then you know practically nothing about my aunt, pursued the self-possessed young lady. Okay, now as you will read the story, you will understand why she is asking these questions. When you will get towards the end of the story, you will understand why this girl was asking him these questions, okay, whether he knew anything about her aunt or not. Okay, now she asked him. He said, only her name and address. He was wondering whether Mrs. Stapleton was in the married or widowed state. An undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. So he was just wondering whether Mrs. Stapleton was a married woman or was she a widow. Okay. So because he had no knowledge even if she had a husband or not, his sister had only written a letter of introduction to Mrs. Stapleton, not Mr. Stapleton. So he had no idea in what state of life this woman was in, or her relationship status. Then and this line means that an undefinable something, that means something about the room in which he was staying, in which he was sitting at that moment, he couldn't define it, he couldn't pinpoint it exactly what it was, but there was something distinct about that room which told him that it had some masculine habitation, that is some manly habitation. That means maybe this room had a touch of a man in it. Okay, that means some man or men used to live in this room. He could feel it. He couldn't pinpoint how, but he could feel it. Then she said, her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago. That would be since your sister's time. Okay, so she said that her great tragedy, the great tragedy of her life actually happened 3 years ago. Okay, 3 years ago, and that would be since your sister's time. That means before your sister, when your sister was here, at that moment the tragedy did not happen, but rather after that time this tragedy happened. Then he said, her tragedy? Somehow, in this restful country spot, tragedy seemed out of place. It was such a blissful and, you know, laid back kind of place. It seemed like people came here to rest, and the fact that there can be a tragedy in such a place was something which Frampton Nuttall had not imagined. Okay, Mr. Nuttall didn't think that a tragedy might strike a place which is as peaceful, as blissful as this, and so the fact that there can be a tragedy there was quite shocking to him. Then she continued, you may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon, said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. This is important. This French window is the titular open window. Okay, the open window, the name of the story which is there, this is actually a reference to this French window which was open. Now what's a French window? Find it out in, find the images of it. It's like a bigger window, okay, not the kind of window that we have, a window which has a very, you know, just a little bit above the floor. The sill of the window is just a little bit above the floor, and you can simply climb over it. You can simply go over it. You can use it as a door also. That is actually a French window. Now, she is telling him, or rather asking him that, have you wondered why you see that French window that we have? We have kept it open even though it is October, even though it is nearing winter. It's autumn, so we should close the window. People normally closes their window during afternoon in this period of time of the year. Then do you wonder why that window is open? Then he said, it is quite warm for the time of the year. But has that window got anything to do with the tragedy? He was already such a nervous person. He was getting even more nervous talking the more he was thinking about the tragedy. Okay, so he just said that, does that window have got something to do with the tragedy? Then look at the manner in which this girl says these words. Out through that window 3 years ago to a day, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favorite shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, you know, and places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. Here, the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human. Okay, so she started telling him what the tragedy was. What was the tragedy? The way she speaks is also very, very, great. The way she is acting out all these things, she's trying to put that tragic effect in her voice, and she tells him that through that window 3 years ago, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for shooting, and while coming back they got caught up in a bog. What is a bog? It's like a quicksand, not a quicksand, like a wet patch of land which gives away suddenly. Okay, it's there in marshy areas. Bogs are very common in marshy areas, and if you step onto a bog, you will slowly get engulfed into the down. Okay, so it's very dangerous actually. For marshy places it is there. So they fell down into a bog. It is a treacherous. Here it means as if it had tricked them, or here it means it is dangerous. Okay, but treacherous actually means when somebody doesn't feel, a person looks to be good but he isn't good. For those persons we use the adjective treacherous. Here it means that maybe the ground looked kind of safe, but it was not actually safe, it was dangerous, and so they got caught up in that bog and they vanished. And the worst thing was that their bodies were never recovered. Okay, that was the dreadful part of it. And this last line that she spoke, in that line her voice also trembled. Okay, and her voice seemed very human, a person who is suffering from tragedy, like that. It seemed like that. It seemed as if she was shaking while she was saying that. She was hesitating. Okay, so it lost the confident tone that it had before, and in the last, while speaking of the tragedy, her voice became kind of human. Okay, as if she was also affected by it.